Well, hello, Confirmands. This is year one, lesson 17. Talking about King David. It's, depending on how you count it, either our first week on just David himself or our third week on Saul and David. But tonight we're going to finish up the David cycle. We are just skimming this thing. David is an incredibly important person in the Bible. He's an incredibly important, his stories are incredibly important. They help you understand some of the stuff that's claimed about Jesus. So jump into your Bible, read the stories. The Bible storybook is fine, but it's not a substitute for the Bible in many places, and this is one of those places. So if you got some time, or if you don't, make some time and think more about these stories about David and continue to learn. Just a reminder that we're on the Lenten schedule. We have the soup suppers, 5:30-ish. 6:30 we do the in-person confirmation discussion group. 7 o'clock we have church, and 8 o'clock continues to be the online confirmation discussion group. Everything in person is mask optional now, and the show is moving to Nelsonville for the next 3 weeks. So March 23rd, March 30th, and April 6th are all at Nelsonville. You're always welcome to come to Peace, but you'll be very, very lonely. It'll be a very quiet, very sort of sad place for you to be if you're expecting to have unlimited treats and soup and the fellowship of friends. So Nelsonville on March 23rd. All right, so when we stopped last time, Saul had died. So let's pick up the story there. Saul was going into battle with the Philistines. He was an old man. He was a bitter man. He didn't have anyone to advise him anymore. David was in hiding from him. He'd killed all the priests, so no one would talk to him. He was facing the Philistines, and he was terrified about what would happen. So he actually went and found a medium to try to bring Samuel's dead spirit back from the dead to talk to him. Somehow this person succeeded. Samuel came swimming up and said, "Hey, what you're doing is forbidden. Tomorrow your sons, gonna die. See ya." Bad news. Don't do that. Don't try to contact the dead. Don't mess around with the spirit world. It's forbidden. But Saul did, and the next day he went into battle, and he was grievously wounded. His sons were killed. Jonathan was killed. 2 other of the sons were killed. And Saul was grievously wounded. He told his armor bearer, asked his armor bearer, "Kill me," because he was afraid that if the Philistines discovered him still alive, they would torture him. The armor bearer refused, and so Saul fell on his own sword, and thus dies the first legitimate king of all Israel. The first words in the phrase that pays this week are "to live a life." To live a life. 4 words. To live a life. So, at any rate, this was a terrible thing, obviously. Israel was routed. The Philistines had killed the king and the princes of Israel. One messenger took Saul's crown and took a bracelet off his arm and ran away and came to David. David asked him, how did the battle go? And the messenger said it was a horrible defeat. The king was killed. The princes were killed. I took his crown, I took this bracelet off his arm and brought them to you. And David mourned, he wept, he loved Jonathan, and he wept for Saul, that he had spent a lot of years fighting Saul's battle, caring for Saul, serving Saul, and so he was very, very sad. And wept for these men that were lost. He asked God where he should go now, and God said, "Take your soldiers and go to Hebron." And so David did that. The next 2 words in the phrase that pays, of honesty. Of honesty. So David's at Hebron, and the men of Judah, remember that's one of the 12 tribes, they make him their king right away. Some of the other tribes, there was one more son of Saul's, some of the other tribes made him the next king. It didn't go well. He didn't last very long. And when he died, was it months? Was it a year? When he died, all of the people of Israel, all of the tribes came to David, and they made him their king. David decided he wanted a new capital, and so he wanted it to be at Jerusalem. So he gathered his armies, and they pushed, I think it was the Jebusites, out of Jerusalem, and took that spot for themselves, and that became their capital city. Now, David wanted to move the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. He thought that, that's where it should be. And so he gathered a whole bunch of soldiers, and they got a cart, and they went and they got the ark, and they were bringing it to Jerusalem. And as they were bringing it, they were celebrating and dancing around the ark. And as they were doing that, they hit a section of rough road, and the driver of the cart reached back to steady the ark, and he died. Because remember, no one's supposed to touch the ark but priests. It's a rule. There are some rules that you just don't ignore, right? Don't mess around with nuclear power plants if you don't know what you're doing. Don't drive on the wrong side of the road. I mean, there's just some rules. And so the driver forgot the rule, and he paid a price for it. And that sort of ruined the party. So they left the ark for a while in the care of a Levite, and later David sent some priests to carry the ark to Jerusalem. They still did the dancing and the celebrating, but there was a reminder for everybody that what God commands, God intends that we do. So David has brought the ark now to Jerusalem. He's building a palace for himself in Jerusalem, and that's where we are at this moment. The next two words of the phrase that pays, and integrity. And integrity. Okay, so David's set now. Saul's sons are all dead. David's cementing his power. He's mighty in battle. Israel is getting stronger. And one day, David asks his servants, "Is any of Saul's family still alive?" Now, they probably thought that David wanted to kill him, because that's the way you do it. If you're a new king, you kill all of the old king's family, all of his wives, all of his children. You don't leave any heir of the old family to challenge you for the throne. And David found out that one of Jonathan's sons had survived. I mean, this is a guy named Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth was only 5 when his father Jonathan was killed, and the family had panicked when Jonathan was killed that the new king would try to destroy all of them, and so they immediately tried to evacuate. They were running away, trying to find a safe place to be. Jonathan's nurse picked him up to carry him. She tripped, she fell on top of this little boy and badly broke his legs, so that he was never able to walk again. And he had been in hiding across the Jordan River out of Israel for all of these years. He's a man now. He's got a wife. He's got a kid of his own. He can't walk. He's completely lame. And suddenly he gets a messenger from the king commanding him to appear. And he had to have thought that David was going to kill him. But what's he going to do? He has to go. So he went into the presence of the king, and he knelt down in front of the king, and David said to him, "You are the son of my friend Jonathan, and Jonathan and I swore a bond of friendship, and we swore that we would take care of one another's children. And so I'm restoring to you all of your father's lands, and you are welcome to eat at my table. You have full freedom to come and go as you please." It was a shocking display of forgiveness and generosity that David made to Mephibosheth in the memory and in honor of his dead friend. So the kingdom is going well. David has wars. He's got his palace. He's got wives. He's got concubines. He's doing pretty good. And one day David is on the roof of his palace, and he looks out, and there on a neighboring structure, there was a woman bathing on her roof. That's where you would bathe. And David is overcome with lust for this woman, and he asks who she is, and his servants tell him, well, that's Bathsheba. Well, tell me about Bathsheba. Well, she's married to Uriah the Hittite. Nuts. Tell me about Uriah the Hittite. Well, as it happens, he's one of your soldiers. He's off fighting a war for you right now. Well, that made David really happy that this beautiful woman's husband was gone. So he summons Bathsheba to his bed. Of course, that's wrong. Of course it's wrong. It's wrong on so many levels. She didn't have any choices. She's a married woman. Her husband is one of David's soldiers. I mean, how do you count the betrayal of that? All of the layers of it. And it gets worse because a little while later, Bathsheba lets David know that she is pregnant. And David panics. So he sends a message to his generals saying, send Uriah home on leave. So they send Uriah home on leave, and David is hoping that Uriah will go home and visit his wife, and that the two of them will have relations, and then, when she's pregnant, Uriah won't count the months very carefully and will think that the child is his. So that's the big plan. The problem is that Uriah the Hittite is a man of honor. And he comes home and he reports to David, what do you want, king? And David says, well, I just want to know how the battle's going. Uriah says, well, it's going pretty good. Anything else? And David says, no, that's it. So why don't you go home and sleep with your wife, and then you can go back to the battle. And Uriah says, I am not going to go home and enjoy the comforts of my home. I'm not going to go home and sleep with my wife when my colleagues, my brothers at arms, are sleeping in mud and blood and laying down their lives. So I'm not going to do it. And David thinks, nuts. And so David throws a party and gets Uriah drunk, and still Uriah doesn't go home. He sleeps it off, on the floor of the palace, because he's an honorable man. He's not going to do that. Now what's David going to do? I mean, Uriah is an honorable man. Bathsheba's pregnant. Ugh. So David writes an order, and he puts it in Uriah's hand. He seals it and puts it in Uriah's hand. And he says, go on back to the fighting. Thank you for your service. Give this to the general. So Uriah does that. And the general gets the orders from Uriah, opens them, doesn't show Uriah, of course. And the orders are, this guy Uriah the Hittite, put him in the front line, attack the city walls, and in the middle of the battle, pull back. I want him dead. So that's what they do. And Uriah the Hittite dies. Well, news gets brought to Bathsheba and David. Bathsheba goes into a period of mourning, and as soon as her period of mourning, I think it was 30 days, as soon as it's over, David summons her back to the palace, marries her, and now she is one of David's wives. There's a prophet in Israel. His name is Nathan. Nathan asks for an audience with the king. And the king says, sure. And Nathan says, I ran into something. I ran into a situation. It's kind of got me bugged, and I'd like your opinion, king. And David says, cool, lay it on me. And Nathan says, there's a rich guy who lives right next door to a poor guy. The rich guy's got flocks and herds. I mean, he's just loaded. The poor guy has one lamb, and it's kind of a family pet. That it stays in with the family, and the kids pet it, and they love it, and they feed it scraps from their table. The one lamb. So the rich guy had company, and instead of taking one of his herd, one of his flock to feed his company, he reached over the fence and he got this poor family's lamb, killed it, and fed it to his guests. I know there's got to be a punishment there, but I'm not clear on what it should be. And David was enraged. And David said, that rich man should die for taking the poor man's lamb. And Nathan said, right. And we're talking about you, king. All your wives, all your concubines, all your wealth. Uriah the Hittite only had the one wife, and you took her from him and took his life. Boom. Well, David was horrified. He saw his behavior in a whole new light. He knew he'd been found out. And Nathan said, because you did this, the child inside her is going to die. David prayed to God. He prayed, please don't take the child. The child did die. That was between Bathsheba and David forever. They ultimately had another child. I think they had many children, but the next child they had was Solomon, who grows up to be the third king of United Israel. But as you're going to see, there's some lumps and some pain between here and there. And David asked for God's forgiveness, and God forgave him. David and Bathsheba had to work all that out, and Uriah's gone. So there's lots there that we could talk about, lots that you might be interested in talking about. The next 3 words of the phrase that pays is a responsibility. Is a responsibility. So time goes on, and David had a son named Absalom, and Absalom wanted to be the next king, and he was kind of a bad guy. He wanted his dad dead. He wanted him dead right now, so he could be king right now. He was a very handsome guy. He was a very charismatic guy. He was very personable, and he would hang out by the city gates, and he would talk to everybody. And when people came, he would find out what they were doing, what their problems were. He would say, if I were only king, I could help you with that, but I'm not. It's very, very sad. He built this huge following. David was doing his work. David was, doing all the king stuff, and Absalom was undercutting his own father, trying to be the next king of Israel. So one day Absalom goes to his pop and he says, hey, Pop, I want to go to Hebron to worship God. David says, great. I'm very happy that you're taking your religious life seriously. Go ahead. So Absalom heads to Hebron, where he's out from under his dad's oversight, and he starts gathering an army. He puts together a big army. News gets to David that his son is marching on him, and David flees Jerusalem, right? He leaves the priests in place. He leaves a couple of servants in place that he hopes will function as spies for him. But David and his commanders flee Jerusalem, and they go out into the wilderness. And Absalom, when he gets to Jerusalem, his pop isn't there. So, he's kind of king, but you're not really king while your dad is still alive and he's still king. So he thinks he's going to march right out and capture his dad. And one of the servants says, your dad's surrounded by some really good fighters. You probably should wait a while and gather your strength. So that seems like a good advice to Absalom, and he does. But while he's doing that, of course, his father is gathering his strength as well. Well, I should tell you that the next 2 words, of every, the phrase that pays, the next 2 words, of every. So, this can't go on forever, and soon we're going to have a war. We're going to have a civil war between a father and his forces and a son and his forces. Absalom wasn't a warrior like David was, but he thought that he should lead his men out into battle like David always had. David wanted to lead his men out into battle, but David's servant said to him, King, you're worth 10,000 of us. If we die, that's a problem. If you die, we lose everything. You're the Lord's anointed. So, no, we're going to go have this battle. And David told everybody, please, if you encounter my son, please remember that I love him. Please treat him with gentleness. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, so the battle is raging, and it starts to go badly for Absalom's forces, and he retreats from the field of battle. Is he riding a mule? Is he riding a horse? He's riding something with 4 legs that wasn't a cow. And this animal takes him under a tree, and he gets caught in the branches of the tree by his head. He's got this long, beautiful hair, and he gets hung up in the tree, and he's hanging there, right? Obviously, he's not just hanging hanging by his head. He's got, his arms, but he can't get himself free. And some of David's soldiers find him hanging there, incredibly vulnerable, and they go tell their commander. And the commander says, didn't you kill him? Well, no, the King David asked us to be gentle. Yeah, no, that ain't going to happen. And he goes and he kills Absalom, and they throw his body into a pit. Well, messengers are dispatched, and several messengers come to David, each with part of the story. But finally, a messenger gets to David who actually knows what happened. And David says, what about my son? What about my son? And finally, the messenger tells him, O king, may all of your enemies be as that man is now. And David knows that his son has been killed, and he falls apart. He loves his son, of course, and he falls apart. He weeps and he wails, and finally, his general comes to him and says, King, listen, the soldiers think that you care more about your enemies than you cared about the people who just laid down their lives, who just fought for you. Come on, pull it together. And so David knows good sense when he hears it, and he pulls it together. And they go back to Jerusalem, and he treats those people who served him and who saved his kingdom with dignity and with respect. The next two words of the phrase that pays, decent person. Decent person. So time goes on, and David he's rich, he's powerful, and he starts to forget that everything he has he got from God. We've seen this before, haven't we? We've heard this song before. And David starts to wonder to himself, I wonder how many soldiers I have anyway. He forgets that God's given him all these victories, and David starts thinking, I got a lot of soldiers. I'm a very powerful man. I have got a lot of resources at my disposal. And he orders his generals to conduct a nationwide canvass counting the number of fighting men that he has under his control. And the generals are like, this is a bad idea, King, because they remember the history. And David makes them do it. And God is unhappy because David is trusting in the force of arms that he can summon rather than in God. And David God speaks to David and sends a plague on Israel, and people get sick and people start to die. And David figures out that he has done something really stupid again. Now, the Bathsheba thing was bad, and here he is being really stupid again after God forgave him. And so he pleads with God to forgive him and to not punish the people. And God says, listen, you go to the place where I'll show you, you build an altar, you offer sacrifices, and I'll forgive you and the people. So David goes, and the place that God wants this altar is owned by someone else. It's a threshing floor, and David buys it and builds an altar there and offers sacrifices and prays a prayer of forgiveness or of confession and forgiveness. God forgives him, heals the land, and that spot is the spot where David thinks we should build a temple to God. And God says to him, no, you're a man of war. You're not going to build a permanent temple for me, but you can get the ball rolling. You can collect the stuff. I'll have your son build me the temple. We'll finish David's life when we talk about his son Solomon next time. As it is, I continue to hope nothing but good for you. I am grateful that we have this opportunity to continue to learn together, whatever's going on in the world. I look forward to seeing you Wednesday night, the 23rd, at Nelsonville for soup supper and for all that follows. You take care of yourself. Be good. Bye.